we've seen some significant progress in regard to kindergarten readiness. And that comes about, I think, for a number of different things. We're emphasizing the science of reading in our child care systems around the state. We think that makes a difference. We also, my wife Fran has been leading the charge in regard to the Dolly Parton Imagination Library. When I became governor 7 years ago, it was in just spots of Ohio. But now we've gotten it. Every child from birth until the age of 5 is eligible. And I look at the state kind of as a whole, as the governor. We're bringing in a lot of jobs to Ohio. We're bringing a lot of companies in. We're really moving forward red hot. But the biggest challenge always is the companies will say, do you have the people who have the training and the background that we need for whatever they're doing? And so it's people. It's always about people. Fran and I have 8 children. We have 28 grandchildren. What we want for these kids is what we want for all the kids in the state, and that is we want them to be able to live up to their God-given potential. And to do that, you've got to stay focused on the basics. You've got to make sure they can read, make sure they can do the math, make sure that they have some understanding of science, they can do critical thinking, they can write. You know, these are just basic things that we just have to continue to focus on.
You know, we've covered crisis in the classroom all across this country for so many years now. Greg Masani, myself, production teams and staffs at different stations all across the country. And I think this is the first time in today's conversation we will talk to a governor of a state in this country. In fact, our guest today is the Honorable Mike DeWine, governor of the state of Ohio. And it is just amazing how much he and his wife have been so involved in changing the educational landscape in Ohio, whether it comes to discipline, whether it comes to structure, whether it's removing DEI and all the other things that don't necessarily get the results to give their child a quality education. So join me today for this special edition of Crisis in the Classroom, where one of our guests for this full show is the Honorable Mike DeWine. Join us. Governor DeWine, thank you so much for joining us for Crisis in the Classroom. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have you on our platform.
Great to be with you. Thank you very much.
Governor, students are still recovering from the pandemic era learning loss. Where do you believe the state stands today in reading and math proficiency, and what measurable benchmarks will define success over the next 3 years for you and your state?
Well, you know, we've put a real emphasis on reading, and we did something a couple of years ago. We asked the legislature to do something that in Ohio we don't usually do, and that is to tell our 635 school districts that they have to do something. And what we told them they had to do is to follow the science of reading. That debate, the kind of the reading wars, how you teach kids to read, is really over with. We know the best way, and that is truly what we now call the science of reading. As you know, it's based on phonics. It's based on sounding words out. So we not only mandated that in every classroom, but we also sent money out to the schools to train the teachers, those who had not been trained that way. In addition to that, we sent them money to change over their curriculum. But as my wife and I, we went out to go to the different schools, and we went to schools, frankly, that had been using the science of reading for, you know, sometimes 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, even before we mandated it, because we wanted to see what problems they ran into. And one of the things that the superintendents told us, the principals, even other teachers, is that some of our teaching colleges in Ohio were not using the science of reading. And so when they would get a young teacher, new teacher to come into the school, they had to go through a whole retraining process. And so we did the second thing, which was to really mandate all of our colleges, with even the private ones, private colleges, independent colleges, as well as the state colleges in Ohio, to follow the science of reading. So big big change. What we've found from other states that have done this and people that we've talked to in schools that changed over, we found that it does take longer than maybe you would like. It's more of a marathon than it is a sprint, but we're making real progress there. The way I think that one way we measure it is this year, for the first time in many years, we've seen some significant progress in regard to kindergarten readiness. And that comes about, I think, for a number of different things. We're emphasizing the science of reading in our child care systems around the state. We think that makes a difference. We also, my wife Fran has been leading the charge in regard to the Dolly Parton Imagination Library. When I became governor 7 years ago, it was in just spots of Ohio. But now we've gotten it, every child from birth until the age of 5 is eligible. 70% of the households that have children that age now are getting a free book in the mail, or sometimes books if they have more than one child in that age group, from the Dolly Parton Imagination Library. So we're leading the country. We're sending out about 415,000 books to these kids, young kids, and getting them more familiar with books and reading. And it's been interesting. As we see people and just talk to them, sometimes at a county fair, I'll stop someone if I see they've got little kids and ask if they've signed up for the Dolly Parton Imagination Library. And so many times they tell us a story about how it's not just for the child, but it's changed their behavior. It's changed what they do at night, and it's established, kind of a ritual in many families of reading a book or two books or five of these little books, before the child goes to bed. So all of these emphasis, all the things that we're doing in regard to reading, we know over the long run is going to, make a difference. We've seen the difference now. We have a big jump this past year in kindergarten readiness. We have not yet seen it in regard to third grade testing or fourth grade testing, and we expect that, in the years to come. So we're making, I think, significant progress in regard to reading. So in regard to math, we are we're getting ready to start doing some of the similar things. There's not quite a gold standard in math, although there certainly is best practices. And we're coming out with our Department of Education with these best practices for our schools to follow, particularly in regard to the curriculum that they're going to follow.
Well, it certainly shows your commitment that you're joining us today for this crisis in the classroom in Ohio. Ohio Governor DeWine has implemented this structure literacy reform aligned with the science of reading, which is very fascinating, the science of reading. What evidence do you see that it is working, and where does it still need to be adjusted, and from your experience and what you've seen thus far?
Well, there's states that frankly jumped into this earlier than Ohio did. I mean, the classic example that's always given is Mississippi. And they dramatically changed. They went from 49th to, somewhere in the top 10. I can't remember the exact number, but that doesn't happen overnight. It takes 5-6 years before this happens, sometimes even longer. So we've seen the evidence with other states. Mississippi is the one that everybody talks about. You've seen it with other states. And we believe that we're seeing it in regard to kindergarten readiness, all the different things that we are doing. But I can just tell you, my wife and I would go out to these schools. We went out to about 40 different schools. And what we wanted to learn is many of them had switched over to the science of reading a few years ago. What we did with the mandate is make sure every school was doing it. But we wanted to go to the schools that had already done it because we wanted to learn what were the challenges that they faced. And there's challenges. The biggest challenge is you have many teachers who, were not taught that way. But in talking to the teachers, veteran teachers who had switched over a few years ago, the story they told us was almost identical in every school. And a teacher would look at us and say, I've been teaching for 15 years, and try as I might, we were still having kids that were not really reading where we wanted them to be. Then we switched over to the science of reading, and the teacher would say, I was reluctant to do it. That's not the way I was taught. It was new. But we did it. The whole school did it. We were told to do it, and we made that transition. And then the teacher would say, I couldn't believe the difference. We could see the difference anecdotally almost overnight once we started using that. And the big difference was that every child was included. And the teachers would then say, they would almost be kind of remorseful and say, I'm sorry I didn't know this 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I feel bad that I was not using that best science. When you go in and watch it in a classroom, as we have done, it's like nothing you've ever seen. I was in kindergarten, first grade, second grade a long time ago. And my wife, it's a long time ago. And
I get it.
we sounded words out, but it wasn't as much fun as the way they're doing. It's almost like it's a rap session with these kids going back and forth. But what my wife noticed, the kids would be in a circle. The teacher's there. She or he has got their notebook going through it. It's fairly regimented, but the kids were having a lot of fun with it. And the thing, as I started to tell you, the thing my wife noticed is that every kid was involved. No matter who that teacher would call on, that child would be able to respond. And we think back to our own school when we had different reading groups. You might have one reading group that was a lot slower in reading. That would have been me, one of those reading groups. My wife would have been one of the smarter ones. She and I started first grade together. But you saw a big difference in those days. Today, when you have all these kids involved, they all respond and they're all engaged. And so, to me, anecdotally, it's amazing to watch it and to see how engaged these kids are and how engaged that teacher is. But the data clearly shows that where it's been tried in this country, and it now is the accepted, really clearly the best practices, it works, and it works exceedingly well. There's one young man who was they brought him in one of the schools we went to, and he was at the point we saw him, he was in high school, and he told his own story, and his story was that I couldn't learn to read. Now he said I just couldn't do it, and he was up well into junior high or maybe even high school before he got an intervention specialist in reading who worked with him one-on-one and used the science of reading, which had not been used before. And it was just like this, he said. He said, I started being able to do it. Highly articulate, smart young man whose life was fundamentally changed by by a good teacher, but also using the best practices and using that, what we today call the science of reading. His life was totally changed. And so we look at reading as the key to everything. It's the key to success in school. It's the key to success in life. And I look at the state kind of as a whole, as the governor. We're bringing in a lot of jobs to Ohio. We're bringing a lot of companies in. We're really moving forward red hot. But the biggest challenge always is the companies will say, do you have the people who have the training and the background that we need for whatever they're doing? And so it's people. It's always about people. And for Ohio to move forward the way we want it to, we can't leave people behind. And that means that we have to make sure that everyone can read. And so that's why our focus has been so much from the Dolly Parton Library to our daycare centers, putting a focus on this. We're also doing something we just started that we know in the long run will have an impact, and we call it Ohio See. One of the things that we found in Ohio, and my guess is every state would have a similar statistics or similar numbers, but in Ohio, the law requires a grade school, every grade school, to do a test, a quick test on children to see whether or not they need an eye exam. And of the children who are identified as needing an eye exam, only one out of every three actually then gets an eye exam. There's no mandate that the school has to do the eye exam. They just have to do the initial screening. And so 2/3 of these kids are not getting an eye exam, which means we've got a bunch of kids out there who aren't being able to see as well as they should be able to see. So we started this program, and it's basically to have a mobile unit come into that school, sit right by the school. The kids go out to that unit. They can do about 8 kids an hour, 6 to 8 kids in an hour, and they test them. And if the child needs glasses, the child will then, that right there has his choice or her choice of which frames to pick. They pick them out, and then about 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, that van comes back and they fit the child with the glasses. And we're just starting that, but there's some great models out there. We know it works, and this is one more thing we're doing in regard to making sure kids are able to read. Can't read very well if you can't see very well. So again, this is one of the things that we're doing in this.
I cannot tell you how much I'm so impressed with your enthusiasm and you and your wife's dedication to the crisis in the classroom. Because if you're committed, the state has no choice. It must affect change. Governor Mike DeWine is joining us for Crisis in the Classroom. I'm Armstrong Williams, your moderator, and we'll be back. And welcome back, Governor DeWine. And I feel as though your wife is joining us today as well. You speak so lovingly and so respectful of her and the impact that she's had on you in pushing this educational agenda. How refreshing. You know, it's interesting because standard testing, Governor, remains quite controversial. And do you believe Ohio, and listening to you, I think you sort of are indicating that Ohio has sort of struck the right balance between accountability and over testing?
Well, I think to be honest, it's always a work in progress. You know, if we think we're doing everything right, we're probably not doing everything right. But I think that we've made some real progress. You know, we do test, we do know what these numbers are, and that's important. You have to know where you are, and you have to know where you are with every different group. It's not just grouping everybody together. You got to know your subgroups exactly where you are. But I think, frankly, the thing that we were not doing uniformly in Ohio was the science of reading. We think it makes we know it's going to make a huge difference. You know, something else that we decided to take on, and again, we're like many states. We have local school boards. We have local superintendents. You know, we believe in local control. We just think that that's people being empowered at the local level is important. But there's some things that are so important, you have to have some uniformity. We did that with the science of reading, but we also did that with this issue about phones in school. And we kind of watched this and listened to teachers. I have a granddaughter who's a teacher. I've got a son who's a teacher. But listen to them, listen to other teachers about how disruptive these phones were in classroom. And even when the child has it in their pocket, but they're not supposed to get it out, but they've got it in their pocket. All the data shows us, and the anecdotes tell us that still is distracting. And so we passed a law in Ohio, which we said, and we kind of eased into it. We first told schools you have to come up with a protocol. But then we saw, again, and we kept watching this and hearing about the problems. And so then we came back and asked the legislature to simply ban the cell phones in school. And when you talk to teachers, teachers are very grateful for that. And because it's difficult for one teacher to say, well, you can't use a phone here, and if another teacher is doing something different. And it's hard for schools to do one thing if the school down the road is doing something else. And so this just took all that pressure off the teachers. And, if someone wanted to blame anybody, they could blame the governor. And that's fine. But it allowed them to say, no, that's what we have to do. We're required now to do that. And one of the changes that teachers have told us about is, well, first of all, in the classroom, they're just getting better results. Seeing kids pay certainly more attention. But it's even in the lunchroom, where it used to be, teachers will describe it, that it used to be kids were down like this, and talking to a kid over here, maybe another one over here, but they're doing it by texting back and forth, and nobody at the table was talking to anybody. But once you ban the phones for the lunchroom as well,
Less distractions.
Kids are
Less
being
distraction.
kids. Kids are talking
Yes.
to each other. Kids are
Yes.
doing what kids do, and it's so important, frankly, for kids to learn how to deal with other kids and other people. That's what life is about. And when they're so focused on that screen, it's just different. And the bullying that even occurs, some of the bullying goes down, and some of the shaming and all the things that we know cause mental health challenges, but also cause loss of learning. And so I'm glad we did it. It's working exceedingly well, and it's something that will make a difference in reading. It'll make a difference in math. It'll make a difference in mental health. It certainly is the right thing to do, and we're happy we did it.
One of the things that you're also doing very well, and you mentioned this briefly, is how you incorporate in health when you talk about kids that you be able to read, so they have to have the proper glasses. But you made a decision that DEI and these other politically correct standards that they implemented in these schools absolutely did more harm than good. Talk about why you made the decision and what has been the results of that decision that you've made in terms of the classes and kids really learning without distractions, Governor.
Well, I think you've kind of described it. The distractions. I mean, we need to kind of stay focused on learning. We had my wife and I, when we were in high school, we had a school principal, and his name was Mr. Malone, and just a great principal, great leader. And this was well before the days of these issues that you just brought up. But I always remember one of the things that he said, and we're talking. This was sometimes in regard to discipline and what kids could do and what kids they could not do. But I think it's applicable to everything. He said, "Look," he says, "anything that gets in the way of a student learning is a problem." He said, if it doesn't get in the way of a student learning, well, we'll talk about it. Then maybe you can do it. And maybe, we can work things out. But if you're a distraction or you're causing a problem, or there's something in this school that's causing a problem that causes us not to be able to focus on learning, that's a real problem. And so I think at different time, different issues, but I think Mr. Malone was absolutely right. And I always remember that. What are the schools for? Schools are for kids to be able to learn. Schools are for kids to develop critical thinking in their writing, critical thinking in their debating, the basics. Unless you have the basics, you can't move on from there. And so it does go back to what I think is our obligation as adults, and what is in the best interest of the state. Fran and I have 8 children. We have 28 grandchildren. What we want for these kids is what we want for all the kids in the state, and that is we want them to be able to live up to their God-given potential. And to do that, you've got to stay focused on the basics. You've got to make sure they can read, make sure they can do the math, make sure that they have some understanding of science, they can do critical thinking, they can write. These are just basic things that we just have to continue to focus on. And
well, it sounds like
get in the way of that are a problem.
It sounds like your home was an incubator and a test in place for you and your family what absolutely works. And you know if it worked for your children and your grandchildren, it can work for all children. But I want to talk about teachers, the workforce, and retention, which is also a critical issue in this formula for success for kids in the classroom. You know, many districts report teacher shortages and burnout. What is your administration doing to attract and retain high quality educators? And do you support this alternative teacher certification pathways? And how do we ensure standards remain high, Governor DeWine?
Yeah, I think an alternative teacher pathway, we have done some things, but frankly, this is something that we're working on to do even more. So we have so many people, if you think about it, who are at the point where they're now in a second career or thinking about a second career. What comes to mind, foremost is people in the military. You know, they're in the military, they're leaders. You know, they're leaders, and that's they've been trained to be leaders, and so then they retire at a fairly young age, and maybe want to start something else. And the ability for us to attract them to teaching, I think, is very, very important. And not make people have to go through a lot of hoops that are not, and over some hurdles that maybe have no relationship to their ability to be able to teach and to go into the classroom. So we've made some progress in Ohio, but frankly, that's one of the things that I've told our team. I've only got about 11 months as governor, and it's something that we just have to really focus on and bring some of these people into teaching. As I mentioned, I've got teachers in my family. I always learn from my kids. I always learn from my grandkids. We always talk about learning from your parents, and I certainly did. But you also can learn from your children. And as I said, I've got a son who's a teacher, a daughter-in-law who's a teacher. I've got a granddaughter who's a teacher. And I see sometimes how tough teaching is. And you do have teacher burnout. So the other thing I think we have to do is hold teaching up as an esteemed profession. And as governor, I try to use the bully pulpit to do that. I visit a lot of schools. I was in a school yesterday when we were doing a rollout of this thing that we call Ohio C, and these kids were putting their glasses on for the first time, and some of them, and saying, "Hey, I can see a lot clearer." Things look very, very different. But whenever I go into a school, I try to hold these teachers up, and we talk about it, because we have some phenomenal teachers who are just making a difference and changing kids' lives. And I bet you could think in your own background. I could think in mine. Where
Yes.
you know
Yes.
one or two or three teachers or maybe more who you can name right now. And I think, for example, every time I'm writing something, I've been writing for a long time, but every time I write something, there's Mrs. Capel over my shoulder. She was our senior English teacher. I thought, oh, Mrs. Capel would not think that was a great idea. That was not how you're supposed to write. That's not how you're supposed to articulate something. And so all of us have teachers in our background who have changed our lives. And so we have to hold them up and say, look, this is an important profession. We want to attract people into that profession.
It makes me reminisce back to my favorite teachers, Mr. Parker. And he said, you can always give a good speech. He said speeches, but it doesn't last. The written word lasts forever. You can go back to it and you have a track record. And my teacher always said that the spoken word reveals charisma, but the written word reveals conscience. And so so it's very, very powerful, I would say. Governor, listen, I don't know if I ever in any of our years of doing crisis in the classroom, I had a discussion with someone like you, the calmness, the experience, the care, the fact that your family impact you, and you understand that everything starts with education, incarceration, human trafficking, crime, self-worth, lack of self-esteem. If we do a very good job in the classroom, we can solve a lot of the socioeconomic issues that we have in our society today. And as you cross the country, these curriculum debates have identified over issues such as race, gender, and parental transparency. How do you believe Ohio should balance academic freedom, parental rights, and classroom neutrality?
Well, that's always a balance, as you say. I mean, look, the parents are the first teachers. The parents, uh, no one's going to love that child more than the parent. So, obviously, involving the parents, we believe in Ohio and certainly in parental rights. You named, if I could just digress for a moment, you named a bunch of things there a moment ago, and you talked about those who are incarcerated. And we look at those individuals. We have about 18,000 people who are incarcerated who come out of our prison every single year. And so what we always say is, look, they're coming back out unless they've been in for a real serious crime. They're coming back out at some point, and we need to give them the skills to be able to make it. I was at our Department of Youth Services, which is our basically our correction system for the younger people. I was there about 2 weeks ago, and we rolled out a new career tech center. And there we had kids who were looking at working on all kinds of different careers, welding, looking at auto mechanics, all kinds of different things. And to me, the most impressive thing was, if I didn't know I was behind the fence, so to speak, I would have thought I was in a regular career tech center in any of our high schools around the state of Ohio. The same thing. These young people who had committed some offense, serious offense, but they were excited about what they were learning. They could see themselves making money. They could see a career, and they were excited. And the same way with the teachers. The teachers were excited about being able to convey that to the young people. So to me, it was a very inspiring thing to see. And again, a lesson that we have to make sure that for everybody, we try to give them the tools that they need to be successful in life. And if they don't have the tools, it's pretty darn tough for them to make it.
More with Ohio Governor Mike DeWine when we return to Crisis in the Classroom. Do you have a chance for about a few more minutes? Do you have to go, Governor? I want to respect your time, because this is such a good conversation about education. Because listen, what you're doing is presenting a structure not only for the state of Ohio, but for the United States, because a lot of our institutions are failing our kids, and you have been willing to get your hands dirty. I'm just curious, how did you realize that you had to be personally involved with your wife to change the educational outcome in the state of Ohio?
Well, I think the governor has to lead, candidly. I've had a long career in politics. I started as a prosecuting attorney. I've been in the state legislature. I was in the United States Congress. But the governor has this bully pulpit, even more than other offices, and particularly when you're dealing with something like education. And so I don't pretend to be an expert in education, but I'm a pretty good listener. And we've reached out to people and listened to people, and some of the things that we have talked about here on the show today, science of reading, for example, we know the evidence is overwhelming. And so when you know the evidence is overwhelming, and as I said, I used to be a prosecutor, so one of the things I say is the jury is returned, there is a verdict, and the verdict is that the science of reading is the way to teach. So using that bully pulpit of the office, I think, is very, very important. Everything we've rolled out in education, after we've done it, we've gone out and sold it. So when we did the science of reading, we went around to 40 some schools in every media market numerous times, and went into those schools and looked at that and talked about it, held up that science of reading, and really pointed to teachers who were doing a great job. We did the same thing when we rolled out this whole thing in regard to getting phones out of schools.
Let me interrupt you a minute because I've got to get you to talk about this because it just an epiphany I just had when you talked about the fact that you were a prosecutor. You know, school safety and student well-being in an environment where they can learn and not feel threatened is so critical to that educational experience. And you know, Governor DeWine, school safety remain a national concern. What investments or reforms are you prioritizing to ensure Ohio students are protected? And even beyond the physical safety, how should schools, not just in Ohio, but across the country, address the rise in student anxiety, the depression, the social disconnection? How do you address those things? Because those things are so critical. And then also, how do you tie it to the home to make sure that no matter what you do in the classroom, it's reinforced at home?
Well, you've talked about a lot of different important things there. I'll just tell you a couple things that we have done. I've had four budgets. We do a budget every 2 years, and in each budget, we have set aside millions of dollars go into the schools so that they could use for what we called wellness. And we told them to put a premium on mental health because we know that there's mental health. You talk about anxiety, you talk about other mental health challenges. And so we've given them specific money that they can use in regard to that. Something we've done for parents is I think is unique to Ohio. There may be other states that have done it, but one of the things I kept hearing from parents is they would tell me, my child has a mental health challenge, and something happens, and I don't know where to go. I can't get help. And so we have a hotline 988, and if someone calls that, they can get help. And when they call, if they say, I've got a child, I got a teenager, whatever the case may be, and he's in a mental health crisis, I don't know what to do. We guarantee that we will have somebody there, no matter whether they live in our Appalachian counties or cities or suburbs. We'll have somebody at their door within 60 minutes. So that is answering the question that people have raised about, I have a crisis, how do I get help? I don't know who to call, I don't know what to do. We've given them that answer, and we just really started doing that statewide about 6 months ago. So we think that will make a difference. We think we know that'll make a difference. We know that giving extra money to schools to focus on mental health makes a difference. You also, though, talked about safety. And of course, safety can be, there are many things you can mean by safety, but we set up for the first time a safety office out of the Department of Public Safety. And we created this something brand new, and schools can call this office. We will come out and do an assessment of the security of your school. We will do that for a private school, we'll do it for a public school, we'll do it parochial school, it doesn't matter. We will come out and give you an assessment. We also have taken money at different periods of time and set that money aside to give schools some help in regard to coming up with the highest level of security for that school. What we want the schools to do is understand what the state of the art is and then be able to give them some help. So that school office is something that we continue to message to schools. If you have a problem, call us, we will come out. I think superintendents today, principals, building principals, everybody it really gets it about school safety. And what we recommend is when you think about maybe an active shooter or something like that, we recommend have a plan, but practice the plan. Have that plan, practice the plan, and then make sure that physically the building is in good shape as well. So we think in a state where local schools, we believe in the local schools, but the state can play a role, and what the state can do is be helpful in regard to that.
And how do you get parents to buy into this? Because what happens at home is equally critical to your success?
Well, I don't know that anybody has a great answer in regard to that. This is something that, when you talk to teachers, they tell you about, and they tell you, you have some parents who are very, very engaged. You have some parents who are not. Sometimes, you have parents who it's hard to engage candidly because they're working two jobs, and they got a lot going on in their life. In other cases, it's parents who just, they aren't prioritizing that. So it's all kind. You get all If you're a teacher, you get all kinds of different things, and teachers have to deal with this. They have to try to engage that parent, and they try to do the best that they can. Again, it's something that I think we need to talk about. Again, we need to talk about the importance of being a parent. But look, it's a challenge. It's a challenge that teachers face, and that society faces every day. The vast majority of parents, want the best for their kids, and sometimes maybe they don't have the time to do it, or they don't know how to relate that to them becoming involved in that child's education. But parents love their kids; they want the best for their kids. But sometimes there's challenges there, and that we have to try to deal with those.
I'm going to conclude. I'm going to conclude my conversation with you because one thing that you can gather from this discussion, and this is something you and I have in common. I come from a family of 10 kids, and let me tell you, my parents were the bedrock of that household. They were the role models, and three things that were important in that household, Governor, was faith, character, and civic formation. It was very important to us. And so, should public schools play a role in character formation and civic literacy? Because there's something we don't talk enough about, which is civic literacy. And if so, how do you define those values in what has become a very pluralistic society? And do you believe students today, Governor, are graduating with a strong understanding of the Constitution, federalism, and civic responsibility?
I think the latter is a challenge, and here's what's happened. And I don't know if it's anybody's fault. It's not anybody's fault. But we put a lot of emphasis on reading. We put a lot of emphasis on math. We put a lot of emphasis on science, and we test for those things. That's all good. But what's happened, the unintended consequence is the teaching of history and the teaching of government, teaching of the founding documents of this country. Sometimes that time space left for that gets cramped. And so one of the things that, if we try to address that, one of the things that we have done is encourage our schools, when they're teaching reading, for example, put content in that reading. If you're teaching a child to read, and they might as well have content in there instead of not much content. And so I've talked to teachers, for example, let's say a fourth grade teacher or fifth grade teacher, and she will say, or he will say, I was surprised that my kids, knew about something about the Revolution or the Civil War or Declaration of Independence. And then I looked back and found out that in the year before, in their reading, the teacher had them read things that were connected to that. So there's a way to combine teaching reading and at the same time get the content. Because if the kids don't get the content, how do you have debates? How do they have an intelligent discussion or make decisions as citizens? We used to look at schools, of one of the functions of schools. If you go back early on in this country and read what people were writing, they said, well, the function of the school is to teach, make you a good citizen. We don't talk that much about that anymore, but I think that is important. And you talked about character. I want to address that for a moment. I think back in my teachers, and teachers that had a huge impact, would tell you, well, that's not right. There are some things that are right, and there's some things that are wrong. Telling the truth, kind of basic things. And I think sometimes we shy away from that today, and we shouldn't be. We should expect, that certain things of our students, and that can certainly be conveyed by that teacher, and that's okay. In fact, it's a good thing.
More with Ohio Governor Mike DeWine when we return to Crisis in the Classroom.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence, there's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
As we close, Governor, if you could change one structural element of Ohio's education system tomorrow without political resistance, what would it be and why?
I don't know if there's one. I don't know if there's one thing. I think there's no magic wand to any of this. It is giving the teachers the support and help that they need, focusing on what is important, measuring that. So we have to, we have to be able to measure to see where we are. All of these things are important, and I think we just have to continue to do those, and we have to frankly get better at all of them. And that's from the government's point of view. It's from in the classroom. It's parents. It's all of us. We have to focus on our people. I have as a lieutenant governor Jim Tressel, used to be coach at Ohio State, Youngstown State, just a great guy. He's my lieutenant governor, making sure that you have the team on the field is so very, very important, and you have the best people, you have them the best trained, they have the best discipline. That's the future of Ohio. That's the future of any state. Woody Hayes, another Ohio State coach, used to say, "You win with people," and we win in Ohio and in every state with people. We win as a country with people who are educated and people who have the skill sets that they need. That's our job, to make sure that we give them that and give them those tools and that opportunity.
I must say this. I really appreciate your humility, your kindness, your calmness, your character, and the fact that this was important to you, this topic of education, the crisis in the classroom. And it shows by you're not rushing, your patience. And just know, for me as a host and a broadcast owner, it really means a lot, because this is what our country needs. More leaders like yourself, people who just care and take time to discuss issues in a substantive way. So even in the simplest way, we can understand. And it all starts with leadership. And so thank you so much for your time. Thank you for caring about crisis in the classroom. Thank you for your wife and your family for shaping you into who you are today. The state of Ohio is very fortunate to have had you as their governor. We appreciate having you today to
Great to be with
discuss
you.
crisis in the classroom. Thank you, Governor, very much.
Thank you very much.
And much more when we come back.
Unbelievable, wasn't it? This man has 11 children, 28 grandchildren. Some are teachers. Wife is heavily involved in education. You can understand why he has learned so much by absorbing so much from his family, from his community. And this is why education in the state of Ohio is working. And it is a model for the rest of our nation. I'm Armstrong Williams. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Crisis in the Classroom.